Okay, everybody, here is our chemical bonds and reactions lecture. So we're still on Unit 1, so this is going to cover everything from chemical bonds to the various reactions, how reactions work, and functional groups. So let's get right down to it. There are three kinds of chemical bonds. There's ionic bonds, there's covalent bonds, and then there's hydrogen bonds. These are the main kinds of bonds, I should say. Hydrogen bonds are on the next page. Ionic bonds have to do with positive and negatives being attracted to each other. So positive ions are called cations, and they are attracted to negative ions, which are called anions. But two positive ions would repel each other, two negative ions would repel each other. So an example of an ionic bond is sodium, Na+, plus chlorine, Cl-, which you could refer to simply as plain old table salt. And they're just attracted to each other because one is positive and one is negative. And then there'd be another sodium over here, another chlorine, and all the positives and negatives would be interspersed amongst each other like that. This is a pretty strong bond, but it's not the strongest of the bonds. The strongest of the bonds are covalent bonds. And covalent bonds happen when molecules or ions actually share electrons. Now, in order to understand this, it's important to note that when you have just an atom, you have the nucleus, and that's where you'll find protons, which are positive, and neutrons, which are neutral. And then the electrons are found in essentially what's called the electron cloud. I just put a whole lot of electrons out there. And this would actually be more of an elliptical shape. It's not really circular, so I kind of drew them in all sorts of weird shapes there, but that's just my drawing skills. That's not really, it would be more of like a, kind of like the planets rotate around the sun in an ellipse like that. And then we can divide them into what are called electron shells. And we don't need to get too deep into this. This is for chemistry class. But it's essentially how close those electrons are to the nucleus. So, there's a shell here and there's a shell here. And what I've done in my drawing, you can have more shells than just two, but I just gave them two shells to keep life simple. And I chose pretty simple molecules in order to do it too. So here we have as our example of a covalent bond, CO2. So carbon dioxide, one carbon, two oxygens. So here's a carbon, here are the two oxygens, so the dots, the big circles there are representing the nuclei, and then the little dots are representing the electrons. For the carbon, I made the electrons green, and for the oxygens, I made the electrons red, so you can see the difference. Now the little circles are elliptical blob things that I've drawn here. Those are the electron shells. So they're each going to have two shells. So let's look at our carbon. It's got this little shell with two electrons floating around in it, just orbiting around the nucleus. And that's not going to be shared. But this outer shell, that's where we get the sharing of electrons. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4 little green electrons. Those are 4 electrons coming from the carbon. But we only have 4 here, and we could have 8 in this outer shell. So this sort of wants 4 more electrons. So in this outer shell here, we have 4, we want 8 electrons. So this is where oxygen comes in. Here we have oxygen again, we have this inner shell filled with 2, and that's how many are in that inner shell. And then over here we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 electrons in this outer shell. We can have 8 in that outer shell. We've got 6. So this oxygen wants 2 more electrons. So what's happening here is carbon wants 4 more electrons in that outer shell. Each oxygen wants 2 more electrons in that outer shell. So when all 3 of these atoms come together, they can create a situation where they all have 8 electrons essentially in their outer shell simply by sharing. So 2 of these oxygen's electrons are going to be shared with the carbon, and the carbon is going to share 2 electrons with the oxygen. And it's not like they're just going to stay here in this little static situation. If we were to just follow, let's just follow this one carbon electron. It's going to rotate around its carbon nucleus, and then it'll spend some time going around this oxygen, and it's going to go back around the carbon, and it'll go around this oxygen. And the same for all of these shared electrons. They're just going to be kind of moseying around all of the what am I trying to say, the atoms, all of the nuclei, and they're all going to be happy because they're all going to have this full shell, outer shell of 8 electrons, essentially, even though they're just borrowing some. But this is a really strong bond because these electrons are really enmeshed with each other. Now, how many extra electrons each atom wants is how many bonds it can make. So carbon can make 4 bonds because it needs to have 4 electrons, 4 extra electrons. So this could be, you know, it gets 2 bonds essentially because it's taken 2 electrons from the oxygens. So like this, and to show a double bond, when we write it out in a little stick form, we would just put 2 little bars. Or it could make 4 separate bonds, 4 single bonds, like with a hydrogen, because hydrogen can only make 1 bond. Oxygen can make 2. We saw it needed 2 more to make its outer shell full. Hydrogen just needs 1 to make its outer shell full. And that's because hydrogen just has this little inner shell. That's the only one it has, and it just has 1 electron. So it just needs 1 more to make it full. So always remember, carbon, 4 bonds. Okay. Okay, so, oh, one more thing about this. This could be polar too. When a covalent molecule is polar, it means that the electrons spend more time around a particular atom than the other. This situation is not polar, but there can be times when the one atom is just sort of hogging the electrons, and that would give it kind of a negative end of the molecule and a positive end. And when we look at water, we'll see that. So our example for a polar covalent bond would be water. Okay. So not this, but H2O does end up being a polar covalent bond. Okay, so where have I lost a, hold on, out of order. Oops, there we go. Sorry about that. Okay, so we saw already that oxygen can make 2 bonds. So here's another way, 2 oxygen, so just O2 or hydrogen peroxide. It can do that. So there's just a 1 double bond, which is 2. Or it could bond, you know, with 2 single bonds. So we have our hydrogens out here. Each one gets 1 there. So the oxygen has 2 hydrogens, and that is a happy molecule. That's a polar covalent bond. And the reason for that is that the oxygen is essentially an electron hog. So the electrons spend all their time around oxygen, or most of their time around oxygen. And that makes this have a partial negative over here. So the oxygen in water has a partial negative, which means that the hydrogens are then going to have a partial positive charge. Okay, now hydrogen, like we saw, it can only make 1 bond, so we could have 2 hydrogens. Oops, I just called that hydrogen peroxide. I'm totally losing my mind here. That would just be O2, so it's oxygen, what we think of as oxygen. A hydrogen peroxide, that is 2 hydrogens, or H2. I don't know why I said that up there. So 2 oxygens, just dioxide, or oxygen is what you think of it as O2. 2 hydrogens would be H2 or hydrogen peroxide. Better to get the bloopers out of the way early in the semester so you guys get used to it. I do that kind of stuff a lot. Sorry about that. Or, again, going back to hydrogen, each hydrogen can make 1 bond, so there it is, having a 1 bond, a single bond for each hydrogen with that oxygen. Now, just as another example, nitrogen is another atom that can make covalent bonds, and it can make 3. So we will often see this little situation where we have NH3, and that is something that you'll see a lot in the body, just a molecule that is used a lot in the body. So there's that. Now, where I'm going with all of this is hydrogen bonding. Hydrogen bonding has to do with this whole polar covalent bond situation and the partial negative and the partial positive. And that's where the partial negative is almost like an ionic bond, and it's just not as strong. It's actually a kind of weak bond because these are just not really completely negative and not completely positive. They're just partially negative and partially positive. So if you think of it as sort of like a little mini ionic bond, that gives you kind of the idea. So here's one water molecule and here's another water molecule. There's the partial negative of this one, here's a partial positive of this one, and they're just going to be kind of weakly attracted to each other. Now this sort of bonding results in surface tension, which is where you see if you have water in a beaker, so here's our little cylinder here, we'll have a graduated cylinder, it could be any sort of cup or whatever, any kind of container, you'll get this sort of dip down in the center where it's almost like it's stuck to the sides of the graduated cylinder, and that's called the meniscus. I don't know if you've seen that before, that kind of like little dip thingy there in a lab class. But just fill up any little glass container and you'll see water doing that. And that is because of what these hydrogen bonds do is they create something called surface tension on water. And it's where you have this situation forming all along the top. So like essentially like that with the various other parts of the water molecule coming up there. So they're forming this like HO part with just these repeating across the top. This is also if you see like a stagnant pond and those little spiders, those water striders that can just kind of run across the top of the water, they're utilizing that. So it's enough to hold something like a little tiny little spider with really long legs and fat feet up, but it wouldn't be enough if, say, you know, anything much weightier than that were to try to walk across the water. Like if I were to try to walk across the water, that's not going to work. I'm just going to sink right in, right? So it's not terribly strong, but it's enough for a little spider guy to move across. Okay, now chemical reactions are often reversible. Not always, but kind of most of the time, I would say. And as our example here, we'll use water. We'll just stay with water. And water can break apart. And when a molecule breaks apart, it's called dissociating. So in any given glass of water, you'll have H2O. That's what we think of as water. But you'll also have situations where you're going to have hydrogens breaking off of that. And you're going to have just an OH group, which has a negative charge, and then a hydrogen that's free that has a positive charge. So in any glass of water that you have, you'll have some OH, you'll have H2O, you'll have hydrogen, you'll have, let's just put another hydrogen out here with some hydrogen bonding happening, and then we can have some hydrogen bonding happening there. So you're just going to have essentially a mixture of OH, hydrogen, and H2O. Now, this OH and the hydrogen could rebond, and then you have just H2O again, but in the meantime, maybe that one is now dissociating. So you're always going to just have a mixture of those. And when you write that in a chemical notation sort of way, you do H2O. These double arrows means that the reaction is reversible. So it'll dissociate to give you OH minus plus hydrogen. Or they can rebond to where you bond the hydrogen back to the OH and you end up with H2O again. And a lot of reactions can go back and forth like this. Okay, so various types of reactions are just the main types of reactions that we're going to be thinking about for this semester, for this unit. There are decomposition reactions, which are called catabolism. Catabolism is any time you break something down. So you're usually breaking it down to get its component parts out or to release energy that was stored in that molecule. So, for example, if you're breaking down ATP, you're releasing a phosphate group, which is something that carries energy, and you're releasing that to use that energy and leaving you with one less phosphate on that molecule. So that's what you would use a decomposition reaction for, or to, it doesn't have to be for energy, it can be just to get the component parts that you need. The way that would be written is, so just using AB, just these letters as the example. AB, so together, yields, the reaction going one way here, A plus B. Okay, so breaking it apart. A real world example that happens in the body a lot is hydrolysis. Hydro means water, hydrolysis means you're adding water, and this might sound a little bit counterintuitive, but it ends up with something, if you think of adding water as breaking it apart, which it just doesn't sound like that would be how it is, but it is. When you add water or something, think of like dissolving things, you know, if you link that in your mind, kind of, you put water on something and it sort of dissolves it and spreads it out. When we get into solutions a bit more, you'll see what I mean. But I mean, everybody has seen, you know, you put water on something and it sort of spreads it out. So think of it like that. So hydrolysis is going to break apart things. So here's a real world reaction using something called sulfate with hydrogen attached to it. So H2SO4 plus water yields reversibly, so this can go back and forth. H3O plus, so there's, you know, usually you would have H2O, this has an extra hydrogen on it, so it gives it a positive charge, plus SO4 should have a negative charge on there. And then we could rebond those back together, or not rebond them, we could break them apart going the other way, okay? And we could end up that way too. So what we did essentially was we took water and that broke up this molecule to give us these separate components here. Now the opposite then would be a synthesis reaction. Synthesis reaction is where you're putting things together. That's called anabolism. Anabolism is when you're building things up. In your body you could use the word anabolism to refer to building cellular structures, or you could refer to it as storing energy. So the opposite of breaking down ATP, it would be creating ATP. So you're taking two separate things and you're adding them together to make them, you know, one. And an example that would be used a lot in the body is dehydration. When you dehydrate a molecule, you take water off of the molecule. You end up putting those two molecules together to have a synthesis reaction. So here, the notation that I use, when I use the R, it's referring to either a functional group or a carbon skeleton, just some other part of the molecule. It could be whatever, it doesn't matter. It could be a bunch of carbons, it could be anything. It doesn't matter. It's just kind of there as a placeholder. The important part here would be to look at this, that what's attached at the end of this R is an OH on this one, and the same for here. So we have two separate, that should say OH, that doesn't really look very good. So two separate molecules, both with an OH at the end. Doesn't matter what's going on with these two R's, they could be whatever. Now, as the reaction goes, so we're doing a dehydration reaction, we're going to pull the water off. So we have two hydrogens and an oxygen that are going to come off, and that's going to make water. Now what happens is we have an oxygen in the middle, we have two R's left over, we need to balance this, so we have an R, the oxygen in the middle, they're both bound to that oxygen. So we've put these two together, and water is essentially a byproduct. So we're going to see that a lot, say when we take simple sugars, like a glucose for example, and we put them together to string together long strings of sugar to make an actual carbohydrate, or what we would call polysaccharide. You'll be giving off a lot of water during that reaction, and you're making essentially just long strings of sugar. If we were to take like a bunch of glucose and do a bunch of dehydration reactions and string together a bunch of glucose, we get glycogen, which is the stored form of glucose. Then if we were to do hydrolysis on the glycogen, we would end up having a situation where we're breaking apart the glycogen and getting the glucose back out again. So all of that, they kind of go together. They're opposites there. Now reversible reaction, we've seen that. It's where you just go back and forth. You know, we saw with like H2O can dissociate into OH minus plus a free hydrogen. It can go back and forth that way. Or an exchange reaction, which is where we're essentially taking two molecules apart and putting them back together in a different way. So AB plus CD gives you AD plus BC. So we're essentially trading molecules. Where you'll see this a lot is with proteins. Trading one amino acid for another to create a brand new protein. And it just gives you unique proteins. Maybe you have enough of this stuff and you need some more of this stuff, so you just kind of trade your amino acids around. So you'll see that a lot. Okay, now functional groups. I brought this up before, so we just want to mention this. This is going to be pretty brief. We don't have too much longer in this lecture. So the functional groups are just groups of atoms that are bonded together. They stay together. They're always going to react in the same way. They react as a group. They're a team, essentially. And we're going to attach them most of the time or often to a carbon skeleton. So just a chain of carbons to create various structures in the body, various important molecules like proteins, lipids, carbohydrates. All of those are organic molecules. Organic molecules are all based on having a carbon skeleton with varying combinations of these functional groups. So here are the four main functional groups. OH minus, that's a hydroxyl group. COOH, that's a carboxyl group. NH3, amino group, and PO4 minus is a phosphate group. So essentially, if we look at our carbon skeleton, remember back from the beginning of this lecture, like 20 minutes ago, that each carbon can get 4 bonds. Each carbon wants 4 bonds. So look at this carbon. It has 1, 2, 3, 4 bonds. This one has 1, 2, 3, 4 bonds. All of them have 4 bonds. And in this case here, they just have hydrogens. But what we can do is we can pluck off hydrogens, and instead we can put on functional groups. And remember that oxygens can have 2 bonds. Nitrogen can have 3 bonds. We'll just put carbon down with 4. And hydrogen can have 1 bond. Okay, we're not going to worry about phosphate. Just know that. It's there. We're just going to worry about these guys. So let's add some functional groups onto our carbon skeleton. And we just have to make sure that we keep our bonds balanced, that we don't put too many bonds on any ion, and that we don't put too few bonds on any ion. So let's start over here. Here's this end carbon. It wants 4 bonds, so we're going to give it a carboxyl group. So we put an O and an H coming off. So here hydrogen is happy because it's got 1 bond. Oxygen is happy because it has 2 bonds. We still have 1 more O to put on, 1 more oxygen, because COOH. So we put it here. Now this oxygen, it doesn't have another hydrogen on it. So it wants 2 bonds, so we give it 2 bonds. And this is okay because look at the carbon. Carbon has 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is one happy little functional group stuck to the end of our carbon skeleton. Now let's do an amino group. Remember, nitrogen gets 3 bonds, carbon gets 4, we know that, so we're going to hook it onto this one. Could be, we could have hooked it onto anywhere, but just here it is. So here's our nitrogen. Let's focus on nitrogen. There's 1, 2, 3 bonds. We lost a hydrogen. That's fine. That can go away. Carbon still has 1, 2, 3, 4 bonds. That's a happy little functional group. And then our last one, let's put a hydroxyl group. We'll put it on this end carbon, but it could have gone on any of the carbons. So carbon has 1, 2, 3, 4 bonds, just like always. Here's the oxygen, 1, 2 bonds. And then there's the hydrogen, just has the 1 bond. So that's a happy little hydroxyl group at the end. So that's how those functional groups will work. And then they can come unbound. We could put a hydrogen back on there, and it could go bind to some other carbon skeleton somewhere and make a whole new nutrient. Okay. Okay, so last thing here, reactions can use energy. If they use up energy, they're called endogonic, and they're going to tend to store that energy. And when they break down, so if you break down that molecule that was created, you would then do the opposite. You would give off energy, and that's called an exergonic reaction. So some take up energy, some give off energy. Many reactions have enzymes that reduce how much energy is needed to do the reaction. And how much energy is needed to run the reaction is called the activation energy. So enzymes are just essentially facilitating, or what we would typically use is the word catalyze. I just lost how to spell catalyze. There we go. They catalyze the reaction. It means it makes it easier. Now, enzymes are not used up, and they are specific for a particular reaction. So if you have an enzyme that is going to catalyze one reaction, it's not going to do another reaction. So you need to have the specific enzyme. And a lot of times you'll see things like coenzymes. Coenzymes help to facilitate also reactions. They act similar to enzymes, and they're often coming from vitamins. So that's why it's important to eat your vitamins. You get these coenzymes that help you do reactions. So they make things so much easier on your body. They make things sometimes possible. Sometimes you cannot do a reaction without the enzyme. There are lots of reactions like that. Okay, so that is it for the reaction section. Our next lecture will be about diffusion and solutions and things like that, different osmotic issues. Okay, that's it.